Good morning, everybody. Nyinyi Nalawangwun Maribudri Gadi Nurada. As a person of white settler heritage, I've tried to say these words in language, not as my right, but as a way of paying respect to this place, to its traditional custodians, and I'd also like to pay respect to elders past, present and future, and to all First Nations people here today. Thank you for coming. Welcome to day 2 of our Visions Forum. Over the course of the forum, you will hear many acknowledgements of country, but to acknowledge is also to see and to look. This is a proposition that the museum itself stages for us. As you entered the museum from Circular Quay, perhaps, your eyes might have travelled through that kind of eye-shaped sculpture of Lindy Lee to the rolling strobe of Wiradjuri and Ngunnawal artist Brooke Andrews' work, Warang, from 2012, a large arrow that flashes to direct our gaze down, to pass through the concrete surface of Circular Quay to the stratigraphy of stone, of blood and history that concrete conceals, but which Andrews' words force into visibility. And then, on the museum's first floor, Wiradjuri and Kamilaroi artist Jonathan Jones also asks us to look, this time to crane our necks upwards. The work is entitled Na, to see or look, and it spreads across the wall a vision of the night sky, each neon light representing both a star in motion and a word from the Gadi language. The work tells us that for the Gadi people to see is not only to extend one's being into the ground, but also into the sky, and to understand both these fields as fields rich with knowledge. As Jones has noted, this invitation to look, to see, reaches us not from some uncomplicated past, but rather from a fraught moment of colonial encounter that is also our present. In looking at the work, we are also placed somewhat in the shoes of Lieutenant William Dawes, who was a First Fleet astronomer who worked on this very site at an observatory in the early 19th century. And he spoke with First Nations people that he met and attempted to record their language. And his notebooks are one reason why the Gadi word and concept of Na'a, so N-A-A, to see or look, is available to us today. So as Dawes arrived with the First Fleet, he brought with him a field of scientific and humanistic knowledge that understood seeing in quite different terms. An operation in which external reality kind of passes seamlessly through the eye to the mind. So as Mark explained yesterday in his introduction, over the past kind of 200 years, critical thinkers from Marx to Fanon to Nick Mersworth have gradually undone this idea, showing us how vision is always historical, it's always contingent, and thus it's always political. So this critical history of vision presents us with a counter-understanding of visuality as an apparatus of domination, of one that surveils and captures life, producing colonized, racialized, gendered and sexuated visual subjects. This panel seeks to step away from this history of vision and its critique somewhat. So our goal really is to decenter vision as the constitutive dominating force of subjectivity, and to instead offer another set of ideas about the types of seeing that are thrown off from the complexity of life. We have some truly amazing speakers that I'm really humbled to be sitting alongside. We have Huey Copeland, who's the Andrew Mellon Chair in the Department of History of Art and Architecture at the University of Pittsburgh, whose work sits at the vibrant intersection of art history, which is, as we heard last night, perhaps a field he is bidding farewell to, and Black Studies. Jungjun Lee is Associate Professor at Rhode Island School of Design, She's a theorist and a researcher in the history of photography and contemporary art, and has just published an amazing book on the history of photography in Korea, an aspect of which she'll be addressing today. Erin Vink is a Nyampa curator and writer. She is the curator of First Nations art, local and global, at the Art Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney. And Katerina Teaiwa is a dancer at one point, a writer, an artist, a curator, wears many hats, whose life and work is tied to the Pacific island of Banaba, which she'll say a little bit more today. She's also a professor at the Australian National University, where she was the founder of the university's first Pacific Studies teaching program. And offering a response to these four amazing speakers today is Stephen Gilchrist, who's an associate professor in the School of Indigenous Studies at the University of Western Australia, the co-director of the Burnt Museum at the University of Western Australia, and I was very lucky to have him as a colleague at the Power Institute at the University of Sydney. So thank you to all those speakers for being here and travelling various distances. As I mentioned, our goal today through these presentations, so we'll have 5 to 10 minute presentations from each of our speakers, a response from Stephen, and then we'll open to discussion. And our goal is not to offer a single or uncomplicated theory of seeing as a field of domination or even as a space of liberation. Instead, like Jones's work, that if you haven't seen already, you will surely catch a glimpse of at least as you leave the lecture theatre, this panel will point to discrete moments of encounter between life worlds, in which to see and to look is a delicate ethical practice. We hope, like Jones, to find in the visual world a route back to the panoply of being, to, in the words of writer Tony Cade Bambara, to heal our imperialized eyes. Thank you very much for being here this morning. I'm going to pass across now to Huey for his presentation.
Good morning. Good morning. All right. Thank you. So it is a pleasure to be back with y'all today here in Sydney on the lands of the Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation. And I want to give my thanks and respects to those custodians of these lands. Today, the Afrotrope is my offering to our exploration of how the visual, inseparable from racialized, gendered, and sexuated modes of violence, at once shapes and surveils, illuminates, and includes the life chances of Blackened beings the world over. I coined the term Afrotrope with the art historian Krista Thompson. It refers to the recurrent visual forms that have emerged from and become central to the formation of African diasporic culture and identity, whether the slave ship icon, produced in 1788 by the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade in Britain, or the 19th century lithograph of an enslaved muzzled woman that became the locus for the cult of Anastasia in Brazil. As these examples suggests, Afrotropes are often translated across various cultural domains as well as transmitted over time and space, accruing particular density at certain moments and seeming to volatilize out of sight at others. Their circulation thus illuminates both how Black subjects have visually reimagined themselves, as well as the despotic technologies of modern cultural formation and image transmission that they've aimed to disrupt and contest. As you'll see here, my prime vehicle for Afrotropic study has been the poster that you see in the photograph on the right, multiply captured in Ernest Withers's picturing of striking Memphis sanitation workers taken on March 29th, 1968, outside of Claiborne Temple. Since then, the I'm a Man motif has served as everything from the basis of a sandwich board worn by the queer American artist Sharon Hayes during a 2005 street performance to a poster wielded by protesters in Benghazi during the Arab Spring in 2011. Perhaps most famously among art historians, Glenn Ligon, whose work you see above at right, took up the sign in this untitled painting of 1988, which now hangs in United States National Gallery. As the artist tells it, he first saw Withers' iconic image of the civil rights movement while interning for New York Congressman Chuck Rangel in the 1980s, only to return to the image in his practice. What I want to focus on this morning, however, are the visual histories that Ligon's painting both evokes and defers, turning us from vision as routinized by art and its institutions to those fleeting traces of what cultural historian Laura Harris calls the aesthetic sociality of Blackness. The majority of the posters were produced by a Memphis lithographer at the behest of their comrades in the local union. Another batch was made in the Claiborne Temple print shop under the direction of Malcolm Blackburn and Reverend James Lawson. The uncertainty around the poster's production is amplified further when we seek to understand who, in fact, came up with the "I am a man" slogan. One story, now partially legitimated by this plaque in front of sanitation worker Joe Warren's home, is that the idea was generated by he and Blackburn there on site in his house. But where did the phrase come from? A poem by Warren or a speech he had heard by Lawson? Some historians argue that it was meant to recall musical tracks, perhaps Muddy Waters' Mannish Boy, or Bo Diddley's even more proximate I'm a Man, both songs released in 1955, not coincidentally the year that Chicago native Emmett Till was gruesomely murdered while on vacation in Mississippi. Deciding which narrative to believe seems arbitrary at best, if not altogether beside the point. Taken together, these claims manifest a collective intelligence, to borrow Cedric Robinson's phrase, that underlines a multivocal demand for the recognition of Black manhood by both folks renowned and unsung in the face of a virulently racist political and visual culture. Memphis was, after all, a city that still looked back nostalgically to the days of pickaninnies on the plantation, leading to the erection of a monument to Jefferson Davis in Federate Square in 1964, the same year the Voting Rights Act ostensibly enshrined legal protections for Black Americans. On that fateful day in March '68, the protesters' signs thus had to function apotropaically, which is to say, as a means of warding off physical and scopic violence. The workers had gathered yet again to protest segregation, low wages, and obscene mistreatment, emblematized by the city sanitation department's callous reaction to the deaths of 2 men who were crushed by a malfunctioning garbage truck the previous month. Eventually, the I Am a Man posters were attached to heavy sticks so that the folks brandishing them could defend themselves should the National Guard renew its attack. And while the signs obscured many of the faces of those that carried them, this too was a useful move. As was revealed in 2010, Withers, who took this image and so many other celebrated depictions of the civil rights movement, was employed at the time as an informant by the FBI to keep tabs on figures such as Martin Luther King, who was assassinated in Memphis not long after the I'm a Man photograph was taken. With these insights at hand, we can now understand the broader field that the poster both engenders and invaginates. First off, as the 1966 photograph on the upper left by Schulke makes clear, the precise origin and form of the I Am a Man sign has always been a shifting target. Pache Ligon's recollection, he may well have seen and transferred a far less famous version of the poster than the one featured in Withers' photograph, which the artist still cites as his source. Our bias toward the work of art over its inspiration have led me and so many others to approach the sign as stilled material available for appropriation, rather than itself a complex aesthetic operation, always in motion, whose history continues to evolve. While Withers' photograph presents us with a single instance, The strike was a series of tactical interventions that unfolded over the course of weeks, of which there is far less consistent and iconic visual documentation. There were marches, boycotts, sit-ins, a mock funeral for democracy held in City Hall, a gospel singing marathon, and insurrectionary performances. My favorite, the passing of garbage cans labeled with the last name of the city's mayor so that funds could be gathered to support the protesters and their families. All told, the sanitation workers' walkout lasted more than 63 days, its solidarity constantly under pressure and its members under threat from white civic leaders, the mainstream press, and their agencies. On the day Withers took his picture, in fact, rumors spread that a black female high school student who had ditched school to demonstrate had been murdered by the police, spurring an uprising that broke out amidst the peaceful protest. Ironically, histories of this moment have long slighted the vital contributions of black women, both to the lives of the sign and to the success of the strike from the very first. Here, for example, is one woman's handmade transformation of the poster. You can hardly see it right there. Her addition of WO before man to render woman is hard to see, but it's nonetheless captured by photography builder Levy while the strike was unfolding. And I think this mark both inscribes her within this sign's scope, while also proleptically marking black women's subsequent effacement from the strike's official narrative for decades. Within the Memphis archives documenting the protest, little heed is paid to the work of organizer Maxine Smith, to the complex role of Gwen Aswam, the only black woman on the city council at the time, let alone to the sole female figure on the left of Withers' picture, who inducts us to the scene and whom has been tentatively identified by Nana Adusei Poku as activist and public school teacher Anna Hall Weathers. There has been a shift in both the historiography and the commemoration of the strike since 2005, in part due to the work of Steve Estes, whose book was published in the same year. Moving beyond Memphis archives, Estes freshly brings into view the contributions not only of Smith, but of Fannie Lou Hamer, Hazel McGee, and Cornelia Crenshaw, who founded the Concerned Citizens group that passed around those garbage cans, made sandwiches, and both materially and emotionally supported the workers and their families. Not only is there an elementary school named after Crenshaw, but now she, McGee's, and Smith's words are permanently inscribed into the walls of the plaza celebrating the 50th anniversary of the strike, though it too ultimately takes its main sculptural form from the sign, which is perforated with words from Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous last "I've been to the mountaintop" speech. Ligon's painting comes to us then as one haunted by these past, present, and future conditions of possibility. However, perhaps the most salient aspect of his work with the sign, which has heretofore gone unremarked, is what he and the camera leave out. That is the colophon at the bottom of the poster, which instead of being the creation of a lone painter in his studio, insists on its belonging to a vexed history of labor, unionization, and collective action in the streets on the part of subjects who made a claim for rights in order to preserve black being in the only terms, those of manhood, that might be legible and in some way countenanced. Yet, it is to other images, histories, and people, other gestures of refusal and celebration made during the strike by black women, to which we must attend if we are to continue rethinking and expanding the visual and its scope. Thank you.
Yamagara, everyone. Before I begin, I'll also acknowledge that I'm a guest on Gadigal. I've spent a lot of my time working and thinking here, so it's important I do this. My place of belonging is Nyempa. I'm a proud Nyempa woman. My ancestors have lived since time immemorial on the banks of the Parwan, which is river country, or what we now call Barorana. And this is important to me to establish before I begin speaking to you, because this grounds my understanding of knowledge and my understanding of place and language, and this is, of course, crucial to how I see the world and understand it. I'll be referencing two artists today, Daniel Boyd and Robert Fielding, both who I've had the great pleasure to work with on ongoing capacities. Long-form engagement with artists and relationship maintenance is a key pillar to my curatorial methodology. And both these artists, we've had many projects and many yarns, so it's nice to pull out some of their works that we've worked on together in the previous years. So the first artist that I would like to speak about is Daniel Boyd. He's a Kudjala, Gungalu, Wanjarabara, Waka Waka, Bundalang, Yagara and Ni Vanuatu man. And if you're not familiar with his work, I highly encourage you to do so. This installation image comes from Treasure Island, which was an exhibition that we curated for the Art Gallery of New South Wales in 2022. And for those not familiar with Dan's practice, he works through many different facets of subject, whether it's the historical, the mythological, the familiar, but this all frames his study, I guess, of interconnected histories and how he draws them into close and vibrant proximity. The structure of Treasure Island attended to his deeply nuanced history and inquiries into the complex and felt legacies of colonialism. And this first selection of works you can see, which is how you encountered the exhibition, introduced the audience to Dan's unique way of seeing the world. Since 2009, Dan has approached painting as an interlocked process of inscription and erasure, and the clear convex dots that he lays down on his canvas effectively holds and withholds information. For Dan, and through lots of conversation with him, we considered them islands of image fragments within a sea of blackness, and this is how he allows information to swallow scenes. They are an intervention into the active scene, and for Dan, he calls these dots lenses. So this technique is informed by Gestalt theory, the allegory of Plato's cave, the search for dark matter, wherein the unseen and the in-between carry important meaning. And the works in this section, including the mesmerising black hole, which you can see towards the right, and a series of 6 untitled works that I'll get to in a minute, all directly refer to these conceptual anchor points, and they contextualise the way in which Dan upends our expectation of how a painting should function. So in 2018, Dan made this series of paintings based on the story of Plato's cave. The 6 compositions are near identical. At the centre of each canvas, we can distinguish the mouth of a nondescript cave, the craggy contours of rock, and the plot of the path towards the opening are delineated slightly per canvas, for the way light seems to penetrate this space varies. What I think is the most interesting about this is the brushwork, and that for some it's rough and hurried and for some it's not. Yet in each scene, we as the viewer, when we're encountering this, occupy the same vantage point and we are placed into the depth of the dark cave. So when sitting on a wall together, these works to me look like strips of celluloid and adjacent frames of photographs. And while they're bathed in different intensities of light, they are direct duplicates of each other. To produce these works, Dan first took screen prints of a cave, fixed it to a canvas, then did his underpainting, dotted the globules of glue, and then painted out with the blackness. So they're rogue replicas of each other, but they embody and subvert the mechanisms of seeing and what he terms image making. These works serve to demonstrate how Dan doesn't simply utilise photography as a source material, he often plays with how Indigenous peoples encounter photography and how we see the world, and he emulates its function. We might think of these works then as proto-photographic, for they restage and reinterpret the act of photographic inscription, and this is predicated on its infinite reproducibility. The works to me stand as a parable for the way we encounter history and the history of photography, and as we know, this has been shaped by structural racism and it's embroiled in white supremacy. So to encounter one of Daniel's work, to me, is about an exploration of expressiveness and the potential of hiding and withholding information to be provocative against the very system that has used indecipherability to exclude and erase Indigenous peoples. Dan's playing in the dark, to me, is an act of reclamation. And so is the case with Robert Fielding. So if you're familiar with Robert, he is a Western Arana and Yunkanjara artist from Mimili in the APY lands. And over the past 10 years of his artistic career, I think we've seen some of his best work in what vision is and how he uses it to map the deep past. So the more culturally loaded Robert's work is, such as this seminal series, I think the more successful his practice has been in speaking to the authorities of who he has sought information from, his ancestors, elders and country. So take this series as an example. He's looking deep into the eyes of his Mayacha. And in constructing the story of himself and his relationship to the photographic lens, we look deep into their eyes and see that they are teaching him that to be an orator is to be a strong keeper of Jukapa, Inma and Milmilpa. As a group, I see this image series celebrating important cultural leadership, but as singular images, you can see that they tell intimate stories of the individual and how their own cultural authority and their own cultural practice has impressed on Robert himself as an image maker. As Robert has stated, he said, "I wanted to capture the essence of each artist through our shared law and culture. They also mama kuntali marchu," which is words for family members. Robert's practice is really interesting, and we have worked through a variety of different mediums. So I must acknowledge that he makes works that are very poetically beautiful, and he draws on a very visually didactic tool, I guess, to employ and put a viewer into the critical interface between seeing and knowing. This is how Robert reinscribes agency and Indigenous voice, particularly within the archive, but around notions of language and sovereignty. What I'm mostly speaking about is Robert's proliferation of text-based artworks that blend Pitjantjatjara, Yunkanjatjara and English together. And it's possible to track the evolution of Robert's experimentations with this to a 2015 work, which you might have seen. It won Robert the Work on Paper Prize at the Telstra National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art Awards. And then 2 years later, he also won that same prize. But he used the phrase Milkale Kuchu, which effectively is a call to audiences to separate themselves from racial prejudice. This is a new work which he's extended into this series called AIM. It's going to be shown in an upcoming show at Maitland Regional Gallery, so a little shout out, go see the exhibition. But this is 10 printed synthetic polymer and aerosol prints, and this series really addresses colonial missionary control of Indigenous bodies and minds, and it's the culmination of 4 years of interrogation into Indigenisation practices in archives. As Indigenous peoples, it's often noted that we're both haunting and haunted by the archive, but it's our interpretation of the past and one's embodiment of spiritual inheritance that can counter the ongoing violence of history and settler inscription. Across this work, Robert has drawn from the United Aboriginal Messenger, which was a periodical published by AIM between 1929 and 1987. And this was a Christian organisation that ran missions and children's homes in South Australia, Northern Territory and Western Australia. One of those homes had Robert's father because he was a person of the stolen generation. So not only is the intergenerational trauma of the stolen generation apparent in the inscription of Robert's work and these images, but it's the counter-narratives arguing that culture continues, which is pivotal. The bold lettering has a quiet strength amongst the busyness of the background of each print, and for me, this is clearly Robert's asserting that he is a sovereign person, and this is his form of resistance to history. So some of Robert's newest works made for this exhibition at Maitland Regional Gallery, which is called Jukupa Handle It, also reaches into unknowability in much the same way that it's been described by Daniel, who we just saw, but also the Martinique-born poet and philosopher Edward Glissant, and Glissant's main argument concerning one's right to opacity, which he strives to be ungraspable. So in works such as this new body of work, Yalta, but there's a whole series that you can see in the show. Opacity to me is very much embodied by Robert's technique of overpainting. He purposely enshrouds his text to control the conditions of the visibility for viewers. And across the series, landscape gives forms to word, word becomes landscape. But as the scene is barely legible, our brains feel unsure of what we should do with this knowledge and this information, which leads us to fill in the void. We must decipher if that we're looking at a letter, or are we looking at the contour of a mountain, or are we looking at a tree branch, or are we looking at shadow? This element is key to anchoring viewers into a scene of tension, and this brings me back to Daniel Boyd, where I'll wrap this up. It's that there are slippages of knowledge between transparency and opacity, and this is where both artists are the grand masters, which reveal and conceal sacred knowledge which should be kept from view. To me, this is a fine example of how Australian First Nations artists are mobilising source material to regain control and to tell what is true.
Kamna Maori and Nisambula Vinaka. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Yes, Huey, you did a good job there, getting everyone to respond. Thank you so much to Nick, Mark, and the teams at the Power Institute and the MCA for hosting all of us. Thank you so much to my colleagues for your amazing words this morning, and also those who spoke yesterday, giving us so much to think about. My mind is a little bit blown, so hopefully I can ground myself this morning. Just acknowledging that we are on unceded Gadigal lands, and I normally live and work on unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands in Canberra at the Australian National University, a few hours south of here. Belonging to lands, oceans, and waterways, kinship and relationality across Oceania are central to my own work in interdisciplinary Pacific Islands studies. I always begin with maps, or with a map, not just because positionality is important, but because my own work is a map, a multi-sited and multi-scalar journey between small islands and continents. I was born and raised in Fiji with ancestral roots on my paternal side in Banaba and Tabitawea in Kiribati, and through my mother, my African-American mother, in Washington, D.C., so represented here by a few yellow triangles. Such a background was definitely not the norm in the 80s or 90s in Fiji, and my sisters and I had a very unusual upbringing, combining the civilizational aspirations of both sides of my family, where my dad was the first Banaban to ever attend a university, and my mum, the eldest child of one of the few high-ranking black men in the US military, Colonel John Thomas Martin Jr., who was the first black head of the DC Selective Service. So there's a few threads here that actually combine some of the histories that my colleagues have talked about this morning. Of course, with all of that military background on my mother's side, my eldest sister, Teresia, went on to become a critical, feminist, anti-military, and decolonial poet, scholar, teacher of the Pacific. Her story and my story are interwoven, and sadly she's passed away, but she's very much the inspiration for a lot of my work. She did, however, and she definitely deeply shaped my interest in our Pacific heritage and in the story of Banaba, which is sort of in the middle there near Nauru, a 6 square kilometer island right in the middle of the world's largest ocean, 1/3 of the whole planet we're in over here, near the equator. So I began research about Banaba, also known as Ocean Island, really cool name for a really, really tiny island, in 1996. And I have never stopped uncovering the layers and fragments that led such a tiny place to impact and transform so many other larger nations and lands. My research mainly focused on Banaba's relationship with Rambi in Fiji, where most of my relatives live, and Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. The island is almost completely made of phosphate, a combination of ancient bird droppings and sedimented maritime phosphate from ancient marine life, built up over thousands of years as a cap on a calcium carbonate and limestone base of the raised coral atoll. Banabans lived here for over 2,000 years, relatively isolated but still interacting with kin on Nauru to the west and the Gilbert Islands to the east. This was not like an easy boat ride away, but hundreds of kilometers of open ocean between these islands. Banaba did not attract the interest of any colonial power until 1899, when a large doorstop in the office of the Pacific Islands Company, literally 5 minutes over there, a 5-minute walk from here, at Macquarie Place, was identified and discovered and identified as pure phosphate, something that was very, very valuable in the 20th century, at the end of the 19th century as well, and continues to be valuable today in the 21st century, especially for green technology. Green technology. The rest is history after this amazing discovery at Macquarie Place, a rather speedy history of empire, industry, civilizing the natives, extracting resources, destroying trees, habitats, and homes, destroying the only sources of fresh drinking water on the island, and basically turning Banaba into a mining town overnight. Eventually, Nauru was also included in the mining enterprise, and that landscape was similarly mined out. Both cultures were irreparably changed and many perished, particularly during World War II when the phosphate enterprises attracted Japanese occupation. This is what Banaba still looks like today, only there's less coconut trees. So what does any of this have to do with visual culture or ways of seeing, which is the theme we've been exploring in this amazing symposium? It's definitely about seeing, acknowledging, and understanding rocks or land or islands more broadly, but with different eyes, with multiple eyes and senses. So when I started my research, I read all the books, and there weren't that many, especially for something that went on for 8 decades, a mining enterprise that went for 80 years. It wasn't like 5 years of mining, 10 years of mining, 20 years of mining. It was 80 years of mining. But there were weirdly not a lot of books out there written about this mining. It was a matter of national security for all the stakeholders involved. Whatever books existed were written by a very, very small group of white men, very celebratory stuff about the Australian, New Zealand, and British pioneers of mining and all the saving of the natives that they did. I wrote a really angry master's thesis in 1996, but then I decided I needed to go and have a look at the primary sources. So I came to the ANU in 1999 as an international PhD student, and what I found was a huge amount of records spread across Canberra, Melbourne, Adelaide, Sydney, Wellington, and Auckland, tracking the mining industry. I didn't get to London because I couldn't afford it, and the whole London part of the story is literally like probably the next 20 years of my life. But I did go about tracking the mining industry and essentially the spread of our little tiny island, 2.5 square miles, 6 square kilometers in the middle of the Pacific. These are just some of the places that it went, and some of the labor flows as well that overlapped with the mining. I track the spread of our land stories, other people's labor, and the growth of Antipodean agriculture across lands dispossessed from their own indigenous Maori and Aboriginal peoples. But what was going on in Australia and Aotearoa New Zealand was extremely dependent on the flows of phosphate from Nauru and Banaba to superphosphate fertilizer factories, servicing all these farms and plantations and commodity chains. At the end of the mining in 1980, after Banabans sued the Crown and the British Phosphate Commissioners, Banaba was left to ruin with no cleanup, fresh water, or electricity, and any other services provided to this day. Most Banabans were displaced to Rambi in Fiji in 1945, and about 350 caretakers still live there today among the pinnacles and ruins of industry. The National Archives of Australia records on phosphate mining, and I love the references in previous speakers to going through the archives and going through the collections and pulling stuff out and literally just changing like one word, adding an object and being like, bam. Like, you know, you don't need a lot of sophisticated interpretation to find extraction and damage and pain and suffering and trauma in these collections. But I did go through and like add the how many files and folders and how much space they took up in the National Archives of the Banaban records. And just in that one archive was 500 meters, half a kilometer of records about an island no one pretty much had ever heard of. In addition to all of that were maps and photographs and film and a huge visual collection, which I noticed that a lot of these men who had written about it before didn't pay a lot of attention to. But those visual collections have photographs of our ancestors. This is really, really important for a displaced Banaban. The visual content within the archives best documents the ways in which the island was possessed by extractive settler colonies and the Banabans sacrificed for, in the words of Western media, the good of mankind. A bit like the US nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands and the ongoing military presence in Micronesia and places like Guam, which is mostly a military base. The good of mankind requires the sacrifice, loss, and damage of everyone else, but especially indigenous peoples. The forms of documentation, the visual form for me compelled a visual response. Like, I ran out of words half the time. I was crying all the time. I was like, you know what? I can't write all of these things down. So in our language, the word for land is tiapa. Tiapa, like apa in Banaba, is land, and it means the rock. Banabans are people of the rock. The body of the land and the body of the people are one. To track the island, to track the land, is to track the people, and vice versa. My work is a process of visually, spiritually, discursively recovering, restoring, repairing, rematriating Banaba, because I cannot do it in a material way without recovering the island from the lands and the guts and the bones of everyone who consumed Antipodean lamb, beef, wheat, grain, cereal, milk, and butter from Australia, New Zealand, Britain, across the whole commodity chain for most of the 20th century. But we can bring land and people and histories together in another way. Repair the body of Banaba from afar, spiritually, visually, discursively, musically, choreographically, poetically. So this is the practice of care, hope, repair, well-being. In my work, it is to reweave the ancestral lines from Banaba to other places, to remind people of the island that fed and supported all the wombs that came before us, and many wombs and communities beyond the island, and to help ground people in the Banaban diaspora in these values of care and mutual sustenance, rather than the extraction which has shaped all politics and economics of both Banaba and Nauru for over a century. These are just a few of my relatives. I have 50 first cousins. My father was the eldest of 10 children in his family. So methodologically, this is a practice of seeing, relating, especially to other Indigenous peoples, to Maori and Aboriginal peoples on the lands that our land was taken to. But seeing is also listening, mapping, remining, reframing, and remixing the archives, and of reading and looking with Banabin Pacific diasporic eyes. Pacific Islanders have many sets of eyes. It's survival 101 in the world's largest ocean. I don't have an image here, but I usually describe this way of seeing and understanding the world to my students as akin to what Kanaka Maoli Hawaiian artist Carl Pau presents as Ki'i Kupuna Makawalu, the ancestor who sees with 8 eyes. This means to see and feel and comprehend in a multi-sided, multi-scalar, complex but grounded way across time and space. You're just always living in this complexity. So looking at photographs of Banabans in the archives, I would try to reanimate them, bring them back to life. Take a cinematic approach where I'd imagine the movements and moments before and after the photograph was taken. There's a lot of breathing that I was doing in the archives where I was like, and what does it mean for these people that I'm looking at to breathe as well? Because I'm a dancer, I was also trying to think of what I was encountering visually in the archives in very embodied ways and trying to imagine what things smelled like, what was in the air. It was phosphate, there was a lot of dust. So I imagine this approach as a kind of a cinematic way of viewing still images, but also combining the embodied and the choreographic so I could recover the people, the lives, the Maori. Maori is our word for, is our greeting. It means life. Are you alive? Are you breathing? And I wanted to bring people back to life. So there are many images from the archives that are arranged across my installation called Project Banaba in a variety of ways. And wherever I put up the installation, the exhibition is usually quite site-specific to a particular aspect of the history that exists in that place. So Project Banaba in Hawke's Bay is 5 minutes down the road from Ravensdown phosphate plant, which basically processed all the phosphate from Banaba and from Nauru and stockpiled all the stuff. So when I went with the curators and the folks from the gallery and we took this photo and we were walking around, like in 3 seconds, people in like weird gear and outfits came out and were like, what are you doing? And I was taking a photo of your factory. They're like, no, you can't take a photo. I was like, is this a defense installation? Like they were all over us. And we were driving in a council car and they were like, no, you can't park there. No, you can't go there. No, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. And I was like, what's up with your phosphate? You know, like, is this like some kind of something going on here? But New Zealand is in trouble from importing phosphate from Morocco, which is described by the indigenous peoples in the Western Sahara as blood phosphate. There are many organic metaphors around this phosphate and extraction. So that's one version of my Project Banaba. This is what I found in the archives, and it gives me chills because you just don't see these kinds of things anymore, and they don't look that happy to be photographed anyway. But this is a very powerful, visually quite a powerful image because it also replicates the pinnacles, the bones of the land that were left behind when the people and the land were displaced and extracted. So this was Project Banaba that was recently in Honolulu at the Bishop Museum. This is a new element of the work, which is also going to be part of a new version of Project Banaba that will be coming up in the Penelope Gallery at the Chowchak-Wee Museum, and we're going to focus on Banabin protest, which was primarily through music and dance, choreography, and like trying to reclaim some aspect of who we are and put it front and center in the protest movements that came out by Banabans, where they tried to sue everybody in the British High Court and failed, and yet still shone for 2 seconds a spotlight on this story. And the judge flew everyone from London to Banaba because he was like, I got to look at this island. People keep talking about this island. I don't know. What's the big deal? So they walked the island. They walked it. They looked at it. They were like, this is really bad. You lose, but you made an ethical and moral point. That's what we got out of that. So I'm like, okay, we can't forget this stuff. This is important stuff. So we're going to feature some of that. And I put my hope into the future generations of Banabans who, we've had like this lull in Banaban activism for a few years and quite a heck of a lot of corruption in between. But now we have young Banaban people who are smart, savvy, awesome, and they're like, give us our human rights. So I'm working really closely with these young people who are going to take this thing international again. And so in honor of them and also in honor of my sister who, first inspired me to think about this stuff, I want to sing one of her poems. I am a terrible singer, so sorry about that. But it's actually an intervention into this concept of seeing that we've been talking about, which is very visual. It's all about the visual. But in the Pacific, and for most indigenous people, singing is a whole-of-body experience. And if you're gonna do repair work, you can sing things back into existence. I was also inspired because when my exhibition opened in Honolulu, one of the people who opened it was the poet laureate of Hawaii, Brandy McDougall. And she was like, I'm gonna sing your sister's song. And I was like, oh my God, I have never tried to sing my sister's song and you're gonna sing my sister's song? And she was like, yes. So in honor of Brandy as well, I'm going to sing the poem, which is to the tune of This Land Is My Land, which everybody knows that song. So here goes. This land is mine land. It used to be our land, from Tabiang to Tabwewa, from Bokonikai to Uma. Birds made this land for posterity. This land is mine land. It used to be our land, but then we leased it to greedy miners who only saw it as something called phosphate and used it for their prosperity. This land is mine land. It used to be our land, but now Ocean Island fertilizes their land. And though they gave us a bit of their money, they left us with all kinds of poverty. This land is mine land. It used to be our land, but now we're living in the Fiji Islands. And though we've had our fair share of problems, our future is full of possibilities. So for us, there's some of those possibilities. Oh my God, I don't know if I'll ever try to do that again, but thank you. Thank you for letting me sing my sister's poem, Mine Lands. And I just wanted to leave you with this image, which is a recent collaboration between myself, Pacific, Aboriginal, South Sea Islander artists, scholars, activists, who we did a little workshop and we put together our own recipes for our decolonial recipes for well-being, self and community care in the academy, because a lot of us are trying to do this hopeful, restoring, repairing work. Kampasin rapa.
Thank you for all the panelists. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging where we are and for thanking everyone who have acknowledged the Gadigal. This place was named for, by and because of the Gadigal. And it's really important that we put back into our field of vision, because for a long time, indigeneity or invisibility has been the precondition of invisibility. So I've been asked to do two things. I might not do all of them. But the panel have asked me not to respond in a very kind of penalty shootout kind of a way, and rather to offer some of my own thinking. So I hope that's okay. I do want to draw out in our conversation some of the words that I wrote down about dimensionality, relation, embodiment, sustenance, refusal, power, self-determination, and perhaps we can do that later. I wanted to, in the 1974 poem by Adrienne Rich, the poet, scholar and activist, asked whether Marie Curie knew that her life's work would eventually kill her as she succumbed to radiation poisoning. The final line of the poem states her wounds came from the same source as her power. The archives are stored in lead boxes. You have to sign waivers. You need protective clothing. It's highly radioactive. A Kenyan-American interdisciplinary scholar uses the idea of contamination and poisoning found in the poem and suggests it could be applied to various strands of African studies, post-colonial studies, Black studies. So I've been trained as an art historian, and that training is deep, and taught most exclusively in... I guess I became increasingly frustrated with the limitations of the discipline, expectations placed on me to somehow remediate art history, decolonize art history, all of these things. Make it less racist, make it more accommodating. And so Indigenous art has historically had to force this expansion in the definitional regimes of which it's positioned, and the institutional spaces that it takes up. And I guess this demonstrates the smallness of the conceptual, racial, aesthetic categories in which Indigenous art and artists have been, I guess, permitted to occupy. So I guess I have not left art history, but decided to position myself in a different disciplinary portfolio and, be in an Indigenous-led organisational structure that, better serves what I see as my work to kind of build up Indigenous systems of knowledge. As we have heard, white supremacist thinking is at the core of many of these disciplinary formations, but I would argue that Indigenous art doesn't exist merely as this tool for colonial condemnation. It must be a tool of cultural revelation. I loved hearing these powerful kind of discussions about, re-spiriting practices. I guess I have been looking at methods of indigenization, which for me is a methodology of relearning. It's a reiterative practice that is about restorative practices. It's about re-spiriting. It's not merely fixated on the practice of the past, but is interested in the future of precedent. It's about not just the preservation of culture, but how it's activated, carried into the future. I guess one of the questions that I'm left with is, how do we frame ourselves in these spaces that demand so much disciplinary loyalty? What are the challenges of our current institutional environments and frameworks? We are burdened with the responsibility of telling our stories in, all of its trauma, but we don't want to spectacularize this trauma. We want to we hold this pain in our bodies, we hold this pain in our families, but it's also a cultural duty to care for ourselves and to our students and to one another. I want us to, think about the politics of care and sustenance, and think about how this can be, a site of caring for and healing from. So if I could invite the panelists to come and we can have a discussion and, yeah.
Thank you, everyone, again, for being here and listening to our presentations, and thank you so much to each of our speakers for your beautiful words. As I mentioned at the start, our ambition with this panel was not to offer you a single idea or vision, or even to oppose any single idea or vision, but rather to offer a multiplicity of different ideas and techniques that in fact decenter vision entirely. The price we pay for that, of course, is that we have less time at the end for questions, but we have some time. And I want to, I guess, begin, as we have all done, with place and country, and I guess ask the panelists to say a little bit more about what learning from place and country might mean in your own work. We were talking earlier about the fact that based in a university as I am, research looks like reading books and looking at archives. And Erin, as a curator's work involves traveling to places, working with community, learning from country. So we have different modes of research and learning that come from different ways of knowing, but also different sites as well. So the question of land, territory, and country, I was wondering if you could each perhaps say a little bit about that in your work.
Do you want me to start? Okay. How I began and introduced myself, that's very common with Indigenous peoples in Australia, but also across the Great Ocean. And it's very important that we establish our positionality and relationality to our own culture and land, but also how that in turn communicates with who we are talking to and whose lands we are on. So that's a very common thing that we do. But it's important because it informs the way that we, I guess, engage with community and understand how they visualize and see and understand and know the world. And one of the things that we've all spoken about together is that this is very telling, and I guess the way we kind of do that is quite different since the failed referendum that we had here last year. Because before, I feel Indigenous peoples and community were a lot more, or had a lot more time for non-Indigenous Australia, and were open to have these conversations around what scene and country means and how you can interpret it. But now we're very much more unapologetic, and you're either going to learn on your own time, and then come and join us. So I feel like how I kind of interpret that now and how I spend time with community, there's a lot more, I guess, provocation for non-Indigenous Australia and visitors to do groundwork before they come to us and want to start conversations.
This sort of work is definitely always happening, you know, at ANU and in an institutional way. But for me, in a more, relational way, over, you know, a really, really long period, I have been trying to build proper relations, particularly with Aboriginal women. And it's been a slow process, but it should be. It should be a slow relational process, and it's come to the point where the same thing happened with Maori women. So I find it really, really interesting. We get to a point where we move into, even though we're all academics, we're all scholars, we all do archival work, like we all have the training, you know, we move into this other mode of care and healing and repair. And that's a theme that's been increasing over time. Like wherever I take Project Banaba and explain what's happened and I let it sit with communities, whether they're Kanaka Maoli women or Aboriginal women or Maori women, the response is the same. It's right. We have to fix this. We have to care. We have to heal. I find that really interesting, and I also think it's a global practice of rematriation where Indigenous women, particularly often working outside the normal institutional and other spaces, even though they might have one foot in those spaces, have realized they can't wait. They can't wait for the institutions, for government, for policy, for a referendum, for anything in order to start that work of repair and healing and care and restoration, because it's so urgent. And it doesn't have to happen in a big, grand, performative, like we announce we now have a special partnership in diplomacy that is going to involve da-da-da, which is what federal government is doing a lot through their First Nations foreign affairs portfolio, and that's good too, but it's kind of being harnessed for the settler colony. But on a ground level, like just talking through what it means to deal with everything from objects to bones to archives to all of these different things that have been stolen or displaced, moved around, destroyed, broken apart, fragmented like our island, and how spiritually, discursively, poetically, via weaving, whatever methods, those things can be gently, beautifully healed and repaired in just small, incremental, slow ways. And so this kind of like the way the Hawaiian curator described it to me, she was like, your work is about rematriation. It's all about rematriation. Go and look up rematriation. We're doing rematriation. And I was like, I know this is different from repatriation, like 100%. But I went into it and we were already doing it. And I think this speaks to a lot of stuff you were talking about yesterday as well in reimagining the mother, or it's a much more expansive definition of mother here. And it's kind of what's needed in a really multi-scalar way, from like that tiny little molecular level all the way to the planetary level. But that is, to me, that's why you go back on country. That's why you go sit down. That's why you stare in the faces of elders and look into their eyes.
I think we all know that the land is the message of the messenger. You know, we need to think less about the kind of the globe and think more about the earth. You know, how do we create more earth-centered economies, earth-centered communities, earth-centered practices, and, you know, Indigenous knowledge of the earth can save the world. But whether or not that's what people want to give, because there's been so much extraction. But I do think that we do need to create these moments of re-spiriting country, reconnecting to country, and that will mean different things for different people.
Amen.
I was going to add, as sitting in the front row with my fellow speakers, what you can't see was the vigorous nodding that was going on. We were unified.
Sense it with my 8 eyes. I could sense the nodding.
So we could collectively feel the motion of agreement. Are there any questions from the audience that you would like to pose to our panel? If you do have a question, please stick your hand up and one of our amazing hosts will come to you.
Thank you all very much. That was a really inspiring, to use that old-fashioned word, group of talks. In response to the focus on the land, I would like to talk about, there was a philosopher called Apeli Huafa who raised the idea that in the West we tended to look at the Pacific as a void with little islands dotted through it, whereas he saw it as a connective tissue made of water, but it was still a connective tissue that was as much a part of the Pacific in the understandings of the Indigenous people as the land. So I think in Australia we've tended to see the land as the important part of Indigenous understanding without really understanding or even having a concept of extending that to the water.
Thank you. I just thank you for your comment. I would disagree with you, and I feel like I'm a freshwater person. Our next panel are all saltwater people, and we have cared for our waters for tens of thousands of years, since millennia. Our land exists because of the water. So I think it's important that you do recognise that, because it is so important to how we exist.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because sometimes it's also a matter of the limitations of imagination around materiality and this distinction of form. Like, that thing is solid and that thing is liquid, and those things are really different. So Ipeli Hauofa was a mentor and an elder of mine and a really, really good friend of our family. And last saw him at my wedding in Fiji, and he was quite sick, and he came with all his tubes and everything, and he was such a profound, amazing thinker. Never described himself as a philosopher, but if I can recommend anyone reading anything, read Ipeli Hauofa's work, because it's decades ahead of its time in imagining something that we desperately need right now, especially under the conditions of climate change, which has to do with waterways, both salt and fresh waterways, as being like the breathing apparatus of the whole planet. So if you don't understand oceans, you don't understand everything. And lands and oceans are connected. All waterways, all lands, all oceans, all rocks are connected. So it's having a very fluid and inclusive understanding of the world. It's a little bit like the scientific a presentation that was right in the beginning, where it was like, what color do you see? And is it black? And is it white? And is it green? Da, da, da. And those are distinctions where you rely on the visual to make decisions about reality. But in Hauofa's world and in the world of most Indigenous peoples, that's not what's important, actually. Whether it's, I don't know, was it white and gold or green and blue or whatever it was. Other things are much more important, and one of those things is that land, ocean, waterways, rocks, sky, earth, past, present, future are actually one, and how to be in the world in that way. So very important what you raised, but also the distinction ontologically, epistemologically, these things are different, and maybe these are ways of being in the world that more people need to figure out. Yeah.
So just following on from that, I was wondering if you could talk about modes of display, because I think a lot of you kind of spoke about the subject of what was in the works, but you know, it's kind of interesting, Huey, that the pole is taken off the placard in Glenn Ligon's work, or Junli, it'd be interested to hear how those, is there a different mode of display for those photographs? Or say, Erin, I know that like there was a density of work in your display of Dan's work, or even kind of Katerina, maybe you kind of touched upon that embodied viewing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, it's a really interesting question that I've thought a lot about, and you know, where if you were to go to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., the way in which they present that Ligon is almost like a kind of icon, right? It's beautifully lit, it's a singular kind of thing, where of course it's just one iteration of what is a whole series, a whole chain, in fact, a whole ecology of different media, materials. So part of what I think is, well, what would it mean to frame the work in that way, right? To frame the work in relationship to the whole set of versions of this signs and ways of thinking and working with it. So we not only provincialize it as an artwork, but we begin to see the different ways in which the transformation of this particular kind of Afrotrope speaks to different needs, historical moments, and urgencies at different given moments. I think there's a way in which the work of Hank Willis Thomas, who's also engaged with the I Am a Man sign, actually performs this, right? So he has this whole series of paintings that were produced by a sign painter in which he takes the motif of the I Am a Man sign and uses it to give you this kind of rhetorical history of African American declarations of selfhood. So it's reframing to think about ain't I a woman? It's reframing to think about the 3/5 clause in the Constitution. So I think that work in and of itself is actually holding out a new logic of display for thinking about the original works.
Thank you for the question. I think the mode of display is critical for the two different kinds of works that I showed, especially the snapshot photos that I think really engages deeply with the different modes of circulation as well, because the snapshots were originally made to be sold to the GIs, and they kept it and went back home as a souvenir, and it circulated in such a way rather than being shown originally being shown at a space of aestheticization or in a gallery and so on. But the black and white ones, that one's really interesting, the 82 one, because it was shown as work of art in a gallery only once in 1983 and never again, because, as I mentioned, it was a failure in terms of making the narrative that fit with the ethno-national kind of rewriting of the history. So I think the absence of the mode of display in it of itself is really telling. Yeah.
If I would love to ask, just ask you a question, June, about that body of photographic work, because I was so struck by Kang's skill in depicting black skin in this in kind of critical detail, which means, a great deal of finesse and basically working against the technology. And also the incredible sense of texture that you got, and the grain of the photograph and the grain of the skin, which opens onto this whole kind of haptic sensibility, especially when it's redoubled by bodies touching each other in the images. So I maybe wonder if you could talk about his, photographic process, right? And how he had to perhaps unlearn certain things about photography to produce these images.
That's also a really critical question, because he was basically just learning what to do and how to do. So the 1982 series, he was actually a junior in college. So the first time really doing the street shooting in a place where it was forbidden for many Koreans to be, and he had the courage to enter the space. And he actually admired an American photographer, Mark Cohen, and the kind of close-up photographs of from the streets of the U.S. that he's never been to, and he really admired, and so he acquired a 24 millimeter lens to explore, and he entered and started using. So I would really relay this to Kang when I return to Seoul, because he would be really happy to hear, because what he was doing at the time was really experimenting rather than unlearning. He was actually learning to become a photographer as a junior. And actually the work that he made, the snapshot, the color photographs, after he graduated, became a really canonical work later on in terms of art history of Korea. But I think it's so critical to return to the earlier body of the work, also because of not just because it tells a different history, but the kind of unlearning that had already been embodied as a student who was learning. And I think just to kind of maybe add to the discussion on the land, I think it will be really interesting to also, in a way, triangulate the land that was formerly occupied by military bases, not just US military, and what happens when the land is expropriated and reclaimed. Because oftentimes today, especially, the real estate business is like really preying on those lands. And the government, for example, the South Korean government is willingly really working with the corporations and real estate businesses to resell and make profit. That often returns back to the United States militaries also. So the military demands money when they are leaving the land, and then the Korean government works with the real estate businesses to pay back to the USFK. So that's an odd circulation of capital.
But if I would love to hear Erin and Katerina, you talk about this kind of question of display, because it's so, key to one's experience of these very different bodies of work. So just really interested in how y'all consider, lighting conditions, materiality, the embodied viewer's movement through the space in ways of, activating a certain kind of engagement that is not normative mode of viewing within an artistic context.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so throughout my whole research process, but particularly when I started in Melbourne in the National Archives, which used to be in an office, I think is there a Lonsdale Street in Melbourne? I actually, not deliberately, but because I have a dance background, experienced the whole city and the archives in a very choreographic way, mainly because I found the social sciences and humanities very limiting on the body, like the body of the researcher, right? Like it was like going from like expansive movement to like this, you know what I mean? And I was really conscious of like holding my body in that position for long periods of time. Because once when you get into your research, like you don't want to move and you're like so there. But my body was like resisting this mode. So I wrote in my thesis about the process of typing, of taking notes, about the square footage of the spaces that I was in the archives, and then what my office at the ANU in the Coombs building, which is this crazy hexagonal structure, what was going on with my body in those spaces. So I'm looking at two-dimensional photographs in the archives, black and white. I'm trying to reanimate the people in the photographs. And then I'm thinking, how am I going to represent this in any kind of humanizing way? Because my lower back pain is off the charts. So it's like I couldn't think without thinking about my lower back pain and what that means to be human as well. So the photographs and the way I use the photographs in the exhibition now have gone from that process of either sitting or standing, and then like rephotographing stuff, and then taking it out of that, putting it into another context like the book or the PowerPoint or whatever. But then in the exhibition, taking it from like something that you have to view like this to something that you have to view like this at whatever distance, and then something that then you view up that way in the sky, looking back and watching you in a much larger format. So I took tiny images of ancestors who didn't look that happy being photographed. I made them much bigger. Then I put them on transparent material, and then I hung them in the gallery in a way where they were watching you move through the space. They were holding the space. We had to be accountable to them. And then choreographically, I hung the land from the sky. The land is not on the ground, the land is up, and you have to look at it, you have to weave around it, and then you're like, those people are watching me the whole time. So I try to change the mode of display in terms of how I received the visual information, the photographic information, and then kind of remixed and represented it in a way that dealt with the body pain, first of all, involved movement through space, but then also like return, the land comes from the sky, from the birds and the bird droppings, and so kind of challenge the orientation of actually where the land is, the source of land is. So really worked with that, so thank you for the question. Yeah.
And with Daniel Boyd, with Treasure Island, it was similar. It was taking the ancestors. Dan had already blown them up larger than life and putting them at eye height. And one of the things that I speak about often with my practice and with the artists that I work with, it's that the artwork comes from country. Like, the artwork is sentient. It is our ancestors. It has spirit. And so it's deep respect to what is shown, regardless of how it's installed or hung in a space. And so with Treasure Island, the first room, you were in the blackness, you were in the dark void, you were in time and space, and you needed the skills to learn how to look and appreciate. And as you've kind of progressed through the exhibition, you moved through different zones of colour that, you know, really play with particular moments of art history. And the last room that you ended, it wasn't so much of this is Dan's most recent work. It was actually this beautiful hang of all the paintings he's done over time of his family members. And it was giving them their moment that they had been stolen. They were blackbirded. They were indentured slaves. But these are actually the kings, the queens of Dan's family, and that it was a moment of celebration, and it wasn't for a white audience. And that's one of the really important things, I think, when you're an Indigenous curator, is that you can have these little modes of reclamation and celebration that only Indigenous peoples will understand. And that was a moment to champion the matriarchs and especially Dan's great-great-grandfather, who was the original member that came from Vanuatu, like to champion him. So it was giving them the elevation that they deserved, rather than what you were saying, Stephen, sometimes Indigenous peoples and our art kind of gets caught in the trappings of we are only victims and we only make art about being victims. But this wasn't. It was to end the exhibition in a moment of celebration.
We've passed our time, which I knew that we would. And I guess we will pause here because there are many threads for us all and you all to follow and to follow up. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you so much to our speakers. On your way out, make sure to look and peer into Jonathan Jones's beautiful work, and then go downstairs and look again. So thank you, June, Huey, Stephen, Erin, and Katerina.